Nicole, and welcome to the NSP Designs YouTube channel. If you're looking for the Nicole Stitches podcast, which is my mostly weekly video podcast where I talk to you about the projects that I'm working on, yarns that I've acquired, patterns that I'm loving, and that kind of thing, this is not that. All of those are labeled with Nicole Stitches podcast and an episode number. I have playlists in my channel as well, so you can watch by year. So you can head over there if that's what you're looking for, or if you'd like to stay here. This is going to be a video about substituting yarn. I'm going to try to cover some of the basics. I am a big yarn substituter, and so I'm going to try and just put some more information out there to make it easier for people to help figure things out. If that seems like something you'd be into, welcome. And so I'm not going to get into the whole thing about the kind of elitism and yarn snobbery. I'm not going to get into all of that here. I have spoken about it on Instagram, and it would eat up a lot of time in the video. But the point is, a lot of people feel like when this happens, they can't make that pattern because it calls for such an expensive yarn and they don't know how to swap in a different yarn. Maybe they tried in the past and it was a total flop and it didn't work out, and now they're just too frustrated or too nervous to do it again. So if they see a pattern that's knit in yarn that costs $27 a skein, they think that they can't make it because they can't afford that and they don't know how to swap it. So that's where this video comes in. I swap in yarns all the time. I barely pay attention anymore to what actual yarn a pattern was made in because I can't afford it a lot of the time. You know, if you are someone who's watched a lot of my videos, you know that I love to knit sweaters, especially. That's like my thing in the knitting world. That's the thing I most love to knit, and I cannot afford a hand-dyed sweater most of the time. I have a very few sweater quantities of hand-dyed yarn in my stash, and those are things that I have saved for, treated myself to. They're special, like sacred things to me, and I just can't afford to always be knitting a sweater in hand-dyed yarn. But a lot of the patterns that come out in the first place were knit in hand-dyed yarn, so there's a conundrum there because I can't afford that kind of lifestyle. You know, I got champagne tastes and a truly budget. So we swap in yarn. So there are some things I'm gonna cover here first, the most important things to get right when you're gonna swap in yarn. I'm gonna start with fiber. So yarn is made of different stuff. That's the summary. Yarn is made of wool, it is made of cotton, linen, other animal fibers like angora and mohair. It's made of acrylic, it's made of bamboo, all kinds of stuff out there. And these different fibers look and behave in different ways. So essentially with wool, starting with wool, I'm not gonna get into the different sheep kinds, like blue-faced Leicester and other ones, merino and all that, because I don't know enough about that, frankly, to delve into it. But what I do know is superwash and non-superwash. That is a really commonly used term. You'll also see it abbreviated as SW for superwash or non-SW, and these two things behave differently. Non-superwash wool is more it's closer to the actual wool that is growing on a sheep. It has not gone through as much processing and treatment as superwash wool. Superwash is a chemical treatment that the yarn goes through. Don't ask me what it is because I don't know. That gives it some different features. So this is a baby jumper that I knit for my niece, and I knit this in Knit Picks Swish DK, which is a superwash wool. And the effects that superwash wool has is that superwash, first of all, if you have sensitivities to wool, like you're allergic to lanolin, which is the natural oil that sheep excrete into their skin and their wool, which I have a wool sensitivity, or if you're actually you're reactive to the fiber itself, superwash wool tends to be better for people who have those reactions because something about this chemical treatment process strips away the allergens that most commonly affect people. So superwash wool can also tend to be softer in your hand. It grows in blocking, which means when you wet the garment and pin it out to block it, it is more likely to grow more, which means get bigger, than non-superwash wool. So for instance, I have worked with a lot of Knit Picks Swish in particular, and I know that this fiber grows this way especially. So I can gain when I wet block something that I knit with this superwash wool, I can gain up to a whole inch in length just during blocking. if I am, aggressive enough. And I don't have to be like really aggressive with the fiber. It just kind of relaxes like that for me. Non-superwash wool does not grow as much. It's also important to remember that non-superwash wool might not be as soft. It might be, it might not be. And superwash and non-superwash wool also takes dye differently. If you know that a specific colorway that you like, and this is true of hand-dyed yarn and like Knit Picks yarn, Knit Picks dyes a lot of colors on all its different bases. Like this colorway Hollyberry, I've gotten it on other bases before. If you know that a given colorway that you really like comes on both superwash and non-superwash yarn, just be aware that if you were to buy a skein of each of those yarns, when they get to you, they're gonna look different. The colors are gonna look a little different. The yarn just accepts and holds on to color differently. Another thing about superwash wool is that most of the time, check the instructions on the wool before you do this, but most of the time you can machine wash and machine dry superwash wool. Don't do that to non-superwash wool. It will felt and you will be very sad. But superwash wool usually can be machine washed and dried. So that is the difference between superwash and non-superwash yarn, explained to you by a peasant who knows nothing about the actual like processing of superwash wool. But I just wanted to create that baseline for you of what that means. I do use a lot of superwash wool because I like swish so much, and because I know if I'm buying online, I know that if I buy a superwash wool, the possibility that I will have my allergic reaction to it is much, much less. Because the superwash process tends to eliminate that for me. Next, I will do cotton. So cotton is a fiber that I really like for garments that I want to wear in the summer, or that I just don't want to be that heavy. This is the ripple crop top I just made, and I knit this in Knit Picks Comfy Fingering, which is one of their fingering weight yarn options. It is a blend, I think. I have some left over here. It is 75% Pima cotton and 25% acrylic. So there is some acrylic in this, which means it won't behave exactly the same as a 100% cotton yarn, but it's pretty similar. So cotton yarn is going to be, it can be rough or it can be incredibly soft. I've worked with Comfy before, and I've worked with like Peaches and Cream from Michael's, Joanne, you can get that in a lot of stores. Cotton is not going to have as much give to it as wool, but it can have just as much or more flowiness. So by give, I mean it's not going to be as interested in stretching. It's not going to have as much elasticity. So if you're trying to maybe knit a heavily cabled piece with cotton yarn, it might be a little more difficult, a little more finicky to work those cables than it would have been if you used a wool yarn, because there's just not as much elasticity naturally in that cotton yarn. It's just not going to have quite as much give for you to stretch those stitches around each other to make your cables. It does mean that it could cause your hands to hurt after a long period of knitting faster than wool yarn would. That's not true for everybody. I still make lots of things in cotton yarn, but that is the case. Cotton yarns also can usually be machine washed and dried. Again, check your instructions. That will come on the yarn tag. They'll tell you what's up. Another nice thing about cotton yarns is that sometimes you can iron what you made as well, which is nice because cotton yarn sometimes will wrinkle. If you have folded it or dropped it in a pile, it might wrinkle and you can iron it. Be careful, check your iron settings, but that is cotton yarn. It can be really soft, it can be really flowy. I actually really like Comfy specifically because it feels really light when I wear garments made in that. It feels really nice. Acrylic yarn. This is a baby sweater that I knit. This is the Belle Isle by NCL Knits. She's got a French name, and I just, every time I say it, I butcher it and then I feel bad. So I'm just gonna call her NCL Knits. But this is the Belle Isle cardigan by NCL Knits. And I knit this in Knit Picks Mighty Stitch, which is an acrylic yarn. It is, I believe, 80% acrylic and 20% superwash wool. Acrylic yarn is made from plastic fibers, that's what acrylic is. And acrylic yarn can feel either pretty rough and plasticky, or it can feel really, really soft and nice. Knit Picks Mighty Stitch is my favorite, one of my favorite acrylic yarns because it feels really, really soft. It's really comfortable to wear. It's really comfortable to have as a blanket. And it's affordable, and it comes in a bajillion colors. They also have a couple of different weights. I've only worked with the worsted, but I know they have like I think they have a bulky and a super bulky. Another acrylic yarn that I like a lot that is also in an affordable price point is Lion brand Heartland. You can find that in like your craft store in Joann, Michaels. I love that yarn. It is really nice. Again, it's really soft. It comes in a bunch of colors. It's really affordable, especially if you have coupons. That's another acrylic yarn that I really like. So for acrylic yarn, you can see that I did do some cable work here. There is give to acrylic yarn for working cables, but it is, again, it's not going to be quite as much as the natural elasticity that wool just has in it. It's just not going to have quite as much natural elasticity to it as wool does, but it does actually have a little bit more elasticity to it than cotton. So things to keep in mind about acrylic is that if you have a wool allergy, this is going to be great for you because there's not, well, there's wool in this acrylic yarn, but generally there's not wool in there. So it's a great alternative. Acrylic yarns are really accessible. You can find them in all kinds of places. You can find them in your local craft store. You can find them if you have a department store that has a craft section. Usually you can find acrylic yarns in there. Lion brand is a really, really common in-store yarn brand that has lots of really nice acrylic yarn options. It comes in a lot of weights, and it's just a really nice product. It is also machine wash and dryable. That is actually how I block everything that I've made so far in acrylic yarn. I toss it in the washing machine and then I toss it in the dryer. A couple of things to know that are maybe detractors for acrylic yarn is that it can, over time, if you are washing and drying it a lot, it can start to feel a little bit rougher. It can start to pill a little bit, which is fine. You can just take like a pill, like a sweater pill remover. It's like a little like gadget doohickey that you can get, or they have like a comb that you can use to get the pills off. Again, it doesn't have quite as much natural give as wool, and you know, environmental impact of acrylic yarn, not great, but sometimes that's the only thing that is attainable for us, and so that's okay. And also sometimes yarn snobs are really rude to people who use acrylic yarn, and that is some garbage behavior, and we're gonna ignore that. Acrylic yarn is great. It's a great option for a lot of people, especially if you are making baby projects. I use acrylic yarn for baby projects all the time because it is so easy to care for. It is inexpensive, so my friends don't have to feel guilty if their baby excretes a bodily fluid onto it. But I've also used it for blankets. It makes great blankets. And you know, you could use it for a sweater for yourself. Who cares? No judgment. No judgment. If it's accessible to you and you like it, knit it, crochet it, wear it, be proud of it. Great job. You did beautiful work. The last fiber, one of the last fibers I'm going to talk about, I don't have an example here for, but that is alpaca. Alpaca is another natural fiber. It comes from an animal, the alpaca. Alpaca is really soft. It can be really, really soft, or it can be a little rougher. Again, that kind of depends on the processing that it has gone through. You can get alpaca in natural colors that are the color of the animal that it came from, or it comes dyed in all kinds of colors. You can get it in lots of different weights. And some of the qualities of alpaca that are really nice are that it is very soft, but it's very warm. So that's something to keep in mind. If you are someone who tends to overheat easily, you might not want a thick, like cabled alpaca sweater. You're gonna get hot. So If you are making a garment out of alpaca, just know there's probably going to be a little bit warmer than even a wool sweater. Alpaca also grows, so it is, and that includes like during blocking and also just over time as you wear and use it. It can relax a lot. So if you want to make a garment that is going to need to keep a very fitted shape, that if it starts to get a little bit more relaxed, you're not going to want to wear it anymore. It's not going to be pleasing to you or flattering to you in your view of yourself. Alpaca might not be the right fit for that. Or you're going to want to find something that blends the alpaca with something else that keeps its shape. So that could mean looking for an alpaca blended with wool, an alpaca blended with acrylic, or with something like nylon. Or you might want to look for a project where you can hold a strand of alpaca with a strand of something else that keeps its shape better, like a separate strand of wool, a separate strand of acrylic, a separate strand of mohair. Something that is going to help the alpaca keep the shape that you gave it over time so that it doesn't grow too much and your stitch definition is not too lost as the fiber relaxes. There is bamboo. I haven't really worked with a ton of bamboo, so I can't speak too in depth on it, but it's another plant fiber like cotton, and I think they have a lot of the same qualities. I know that bamboo tends to be really, really soft feeling and nice against the skin, so it's great for garments. I know it tends to feel really, really light, which is nice. There is linen, another plant fiber. Linen tends to feel a little more stiff than cotton yarn. It just is. It has even less elasticity than cotton yarn, but it can create a really nice light fabric that feels really cool against your skin. You know, it doesn't hold too much heat and cause you to overheat or anything. It feels a little bit more stiff and starchy to work with, and it doesn't have as much of that natural elasticity. So knitting ribbing with linen yarn is a little bit of a pain in the neck because it doesn't want to flex and give for you quite as much, but it can yield a beautiful finished garment, especially summer garments and spring garments. And it can work great paired with other cottons, especially if the linen is blended with something that might give it a little more softness and give. For example, I am making a sweater right now that uses a 100% cotton yarn and a blend yarn that is 70% cotton and 30% linen. And I can definitely tell that there's linen in there because it does have that kind of stiffer feel. It just feels different from the 100% cotton fiber, but it is creating a really beautiful fabric, and the two of them are playing really nicely together. There's one other fiber that I wanted to talk about, and I do not have any direct experience working with this fiber because I am allergic to it, much more allergic to it than I am to wool. I can kind of deal with wool. I cannot have this fiber near my body, but it is very popular, especially right now. It's very trendy, and that is mohair. Mohair is an animal fiber, and it most often comes in a lace weight. And right now, lots and lots of designers are creating patterns where you hold a strand of that lace weight mohair. You either hold it double to make a fingering weight gauge, or you hold it with a strand of fingering weight or above yarn. And the function of the mohair in that space is to give fluff, like halo, which is the like fuzzy glow that a knit piece has, and softness to the garment. So for example, this is my Cozy Classic Raglan, which is a design by Jessie Maed, and this is a pattern that is designed with the ability in mind to be able to hold a strand of mohair and a strand of fingering weight yarn dyed together. So if you look closely at my stitches, you can kind of see that there is a light white strand paired with the colored strands. It's a little bit difficult to see because the other yarn I used also has a white base, but you can kind of see it there. So I didn't use mohair for this because, like I said, I'm allergic, but that is often right now how mohair is used. Mohair can add softness, to a garment, but honestly for me and for a lot of other people, mohair actually just feels very itchy. That halo kind of irritates your skin. So next I thought I would talk about what I do to figure out how to sub in a yarn. So I have a pile here of my finished objects. I've shown you a few. I'm going to show you a few more. And I'm going to tell you about the yarn weight that was called for them and what I used and how I figured out how to make those swaps. So I'm going to start with my Spellman sweater, which is a design by Dragon Horde Design. Here it is. This sweater design called for a sport weight yarn. And for this, I used Knit Picks Paragon, which I don't remember the blend of, but it is available on knitpicks.com. And this pattern called, Tristan designed this, so Tristan used her own yarn for this, which is fine, cool, great. She dyes beautiful yarn, upsettingly beautiful yarn, but I could not at the time afford a whole sweater in her yarn, which is also fine. So what I needed to do is figure out a yarn replacement and how much of that I would need. So I knew when I'm going to replace yarn for a sweater pattern, I need to figure out a few things. Do I already know of a yarn that I want to use? When do I want to wear this? And how do I want to wear this? Is there any change that I want to make to it? Make it longer, make it shorter, make it short sleeves, make it long sleeves. Do I have yarn in my stash already? Do I want to buy more? What colors do I want to use? That kind of thing. So the things that you need to pay attention to when you're going to sub in yarn are basically the yarn weight that you need. What yarn weight is this made in? Yardage. So what size you're going to make and how many yards you need to make that size. Qualities of the garment that either it needs to have, which means that it was designed to have, or that you want it to have, because that might be different. And any modifications that you plan to make. So again, do I want it to be longer, shorter, long sleeve, short sleeve? Do I want to steek it? That kind of thing. There are some basic yarn weights out there. There's lace, fingering, sport, DK, worsted, bulky, and super bulky. And between them, there are some kind of in-betweeny guys, like there's like a light fingering that's between lace and fingering, and honestly, sport can, with some regularity, be swapped in for DK. They can kind of replace one another, that kind of thing. There are also ways to pair smaller yarn weights together to get a bigger weight. So for instance, this is the Baldelia by Marie-Amélie Designs. This calls for either a DK or worsted weight. I don't remember. I'll put it on the screen. But I actually held 2 strands of fingering weight yarn together to get the same gauge as what a 1 strand of regular yarn in the correct weight would have been. So you need to figure out the yarn weight that the pattern calls for. Sometimes the pattern will tell you this outright. They will tell you it was so-and-so brand sport weight yarn. Sometimes it is in the name of the yarn, like Knit Pick Swish DK. It's a DK yarn. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily say that, and you might have to do a little research. But usually they will also tell you gauge, which is really, really helpful when you are swapping in yarns, especially if you're new to it, you haven't done it a lot before, and especially if it's a garment that is going to have to fit a specific body. So figure out your yarn weight that you need. Let's say that you need a DK weight. So from there you can decide, do I want to seek out a DK weight yarn? Do I want to look at sport weight yarns? Because maybe the DK weight yarns that I found that are in my price range, I don't like any of the colors, or it's all sold out, or I don't like the way any of them feels against my skin. So maybe you can use a sport weight yarn, and as long as you get gauge, you're fine. Or maybe you want to use 2 strands of fingering weight yarn because you really like this fingering weight yarn, and using 2 strands held together is an effect that you're going for. It's something you can afford to do right now. You have a ton of fingering weight yarn in your stash and you want to use it up, whatever. As long as you get gauge, that's fine. You're able to kind of be a little fluid in what base you use for a sweater in terms of like the yarn weight, as long as you're paying attention to the other qualities, like the gauge it's going to yield, and as long as you know that it might kind of change how the fabric that you make behaves. So if you're going to hold together 2 strands of fingering weight yarn, the actual fabric that you create is maybe going to feel a little more dense than if you used 1 strand of a DK weight wool. It might have a little bit less flow to it. My 2-stranded fingering weight sweater, you can see it does still have a nice flow to it. It's very light, it's very soft. So for me, it wasn't really a big deal that I used 2 strands held together versus 1 single strand. But that is just something to keep in mind. And if you're not sure, maybe, you know, grab 2 strands of fingering weight yarn, knit a little swatch, see if you like the way that feels. If you don't, back to the drawing board. Really what's important if you're going to switch out your yarn weights like that is to get gauge. So gauge is the thing, it's basically a like a 1 true scale of a knit fabric that tells you that you are matching up with measurements that the designer came up with, and your finished garment is going to fit the way the designer intends it to. Gauge will be expressed as the number of rows, so row, 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 and the number of stitches, which is each stitch across, usually across 4 inches. So there are gauge tools out there that you can purchase that will have either a 4-inch square or a 2-inch square or sometimes a 1-inch square, and it will be marked out, and you can just, you know, start knitting and hold your gauge tool over it and just count. Or what you can do if you don't have one of those tools available to you is you can knit your little swatch, and you can put pins. You can measure a 4-inch swath with a measuring tape and put a pin or a stitch marker at either end of that 4-inch span that you measured, and you can count that way. So as long as you get gauge, which means that the number of rows and the number of stitches that are in your 4-inch piece, as long as they are the same as or reasonably close to the gauge the designer tells you, you're good. You're gonna be fine. You're good to go. For me personally, if my gauge is within like 2 or 3 stitches or 1 or 2 rows of what the designer says, I don't care beyond that. I consider myself on gauge and I move forward. I am willing to take that little bit of, you know, that margin of error. Some people are not comfortable doing that. They want their gauge to be absolutely spot on, and that's okay too. So you have figured out what yarn base you need, and you have taken note of what the gauge is and needs to be for the pattern. Next, you need to consider what qualities you want your garment to have. Do you want to wear this in or your finished piece, your shawl, whatever. I'm gonna talk garments because that's mostly what I make. What qualities do you want it to have? Do you want to wear it in warm weather? Do you want to wear it in cold weather? Do you want to be able to wear it in both? If I know that I want to make something that I want to wear in warm weather, I'm gonna look for a cotton or a linen, maybe a bamboo, because I live in a place that gets pretty warm in the warm season, and so a wool sweater is not gonna happen. So I want something that is going to feel light and airy when I wear that garment. You don't have to use the same fiber base as the designer. Like I said, I am knitting a sweater right now that is cotton and a cotton linen blend yarn. That sweater was designed as a sweater with wool yarn. I just wanted to wear it in a warmer season, so I'm using cotton yarn. But I took the time to consider the differences that those fibers are going to have in my finished product and kind of evaluate my options before I totally made that call. So, you know, if you want it to be flowier, you might want to use a cotton or a bamboo versus a 100% linen, because linen is going to have just a little more stiffness to it. If you really don't like something itchy on your arm, you might want to look for a superwash wool versus a non-superwash wool, because sometimes non-superwash wools tend to be more rustic, which is a nice way of saying itchy. So think about those qualities that you want your garment to have. Finally, what you now need to do, because you've determined what you're making, the weight of yarn that you're making it out of, the fiber content, and your colors, and you've chosen your yarn, right? You need to know how much of that yarn you have to buy. And this is where you have to do some math. Some designers are very nice, and when they tell you what kind of yarn they're using, they will also tell you how many yards per skein, and then how many skeins for your size. Sometimes the pattern will only say how many skeins, and that helps almost nobody. It helps almost no one unless you're going to use that specific yarn, which a lot of people aren't. So then you have to kind of look around and, you know, give it a Google, look up that yarn and find out how many yards are in one skein of that yarn. So say in my DK weight sweater, I'm going to knit a large, and that means that I need 8 skeins. And the model yarn that is used for the base pattern, there are 100 yards per skein of that yarn. So if I know that I need to knit, if I know that I'm knitting the large, and the large would take 8 skeins of the model yarn, and the model yarn is 100 yards per skein, that means I need to multiply 8 by 100 to see how many total yards I need. So here it would be 800. I picked easy math because I'm bad at math. So I need 800 yards of DK weight yarn. You can also do this with grams. I don't bother with the grams. I go for the yards. That just works for my brain better. But overall, I know that I need 800 hypothetical yards of yarn. So now what I can do is go back to wherever my yarn source is going to be. Let's say Knit Picks, because let's be honest. I know that Knit Picks Swish DK comes in skeins of 123 yards per skein. So that's a little bit more per skein than whatever the model yarn was. So I don't actually need the same number of skeins, but how many do I need? Take the number of yards in a skein of the yarn that you want to use. So we're going to take 123, and you're going to divide that into the total of yards that you need for the entire project. So for me, I need 800 yards. I'm going to divide that by 123 yards. And that final number, which I don't know, I'm not going to... I'm going to put it on screen. I can't come up with it off the top of my head. I have an English degree, not a math degree. That is going to tell me how many skeins of Swish DK I need. So, and it's going to be something uneven because 123 is a weird number that's not going to divide evenly into 800. But whatever that overage is, the point whatever, I just get another skein to account for that. And I know that I will have a little bit left over. Now, that also is that's a little bit of a judgment call, because if your decimal, you know, your remainder is kind of a low number, it's possible that the designer built in a yarn cushion in the yardage that they told you that you need. That means that they told you that you actually need a little bit more yarn than you truly will, because they know that people have different gauges. So if you are comfortable taking the risk, if the decimal is pretty low, you might want to not get that extra skein to account for the decimal. You might just want to get like 6. Let's say that the total was like 6.12. And I know that the designer put a cushion into the yardage requirements for me. I might feel comfortable enough to say, you know what, I'm not going to buy a whole 7th skein for that 0.12. I'm going to buy 6. And that's it. And so that might mean that I still have plenty of yarn, or it might mean that I play yarn chicken, or it might mean that I actually don't have enough yarn. That is a judgment call that you have to make based on, do you know that the designer included a yarn cushion? Do you know how much the yarn cushion was? Some designers are pretty upfront in telling you that they did that and how much they did, which is nice. Have you knit from them before, and did you have leftover yarn, and how much? And are you okay with potentially needing to get more yarn down the line because you ran out? So that's a consideration to keep in mind. But that is the math that I do to figure out how much yarn I need when I'm swapping something in. Once I know what yarn base I'm using, if I'm using the same base, that does make it a little bit easier. I figure out how many yards I need to knit my desired size, how many yards are in a skein of the yarn I want to use, and then I do a little division and I figure it out. Keep in mind, if you are going to use 2 strands held double, you need that much yarn twice, because you're using both strands the whole time. So if I was going to use, for my 800 yard sweater, if I was going to use 2 strands of fingering weight held double, I would need 800 yards of each fingering yarn that I'm using. So I would need 1600 yards total. If I wanted my sweater to have short sleeves versus long, I might cut off a skein of yarn from the total that I need, because I don't need to knit full sleeves, so I don't need all that yarn. Conversely, if I want to make a short sleeve sweater long sleeved, I might add 1 skein or even 2 to my total to account for the extra yarn that I'm gonna need, that kind of thing. So figure out the features that you want your finished product to have, if that means that you're going to need more or less yarn, and factor that into your math when you come up with your final total. But really, that is it. That is how you can swap in yarn. Know a little bit about the bases that are out there and what you're looking for in what you're making. Keep in mind that, at least in the beginning, when you first get into it, you're probably gonna wanna check your gauge to make sure it's on point. And what you're comfortable with as a margin of error for gauge if it's off a little bit in either direction. And look at what's available, and then do a little bit of your math. So I hope that this was helpful. It might be a little bit convoluted and long-winded, but I hope that there was some helpful information here. I do get a lot of questions when I make yarn swaps about the features of the yarn that I use. I've gotten lots of questions about Knit Pick Swish and about Stroll, which is the name of the yarn that I used for this sweater. And just general kind of guidance and help about swapping in yarns. It really seems like a more intimidating thing than it is. Really all it is kind of thinking about your options that you have and then doing some math, some very easy math. So I hope that helps somebody. If you want another video about yarn swapping options and stuff, let me know when I can do that. Let me know what you want me to talk about, what you want addressed. But I think I'm gonna call it. So I hope this video was helpful for somebody and it helped you out if you've been nervous about making yarn swaps. Maybe it gave you some insight and assistance and maybe the confidence to try it. And hope this helps make knitting beautiful patterns feel more accessible to more knitters, because that's really what we should be doing here. So yeah, thank you for watching. I appreciate it. If you liked it, give it a like. Comment below with if there's anything that I glossed over, I didn't cover, I forgot. You have any questions at all, leave them in the comments and I'll get to you as soon as I can. Have a great week. I hope you get lots of crafting done, lots of yarn swapping done. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.